So, picking up in chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby, we see Gatsby showing off to Nick Carraway, trying to impress him by telling him all of these fantastic, wild things that he's done in his life. And he actually has proof to back up what he's saying, too. Medals of valor from the war, pictures of himself at Oxford. So even though these stories are wild and it seems like some sort of fantasy, Nick can't really refute them. And it's still a bit of a mystery as to why Gatsby is telling him all of this. We can see that he desperately wants Nick's approval. He wants Nick to think that he's a somebody, not just some random guy. And then his motivations start to become clear. He says that he's going to ask a big favor of Nick. And he even goes so far as to produce, I guess you could call him a character witness of sorts for himself, by introducing Nick to his friend, Mr. Wolfsheim. And this is kind of an odd move on Gatsby's part, because if he's trying to convince Nick that he's the real deal, a respectable gentleman, Wolfsheim, even though he does give Gatsby the praise that he was probably hoping for, isn't the most respectable business person himself. He's kind of an odd choice as a character witness. We learn that Wolfsheim is involved in shady business dealings of some sort, business connections, as he calls them. It's purposely kept vague. We learned that he fixed the 1919 World Series, that he's been friends with gangsters who've been shot to death at supper. He's probably a bit of a gangster, or maybe even some sort of a mob boss himself. He has a human tooth, a molar, as a button cuff on one of his suits. So that's never a good sign. Where did the tooth come from is probably the next question somebody would have there. So really, this might make Gatsby look even more suspicious than he already did. Because remember, the question is still out there. How did he get all of his money? If he got it through business connections with Wolfsheim, it probably wasn't all above board. But finally, Gatsby gets around to making his big request. Actually, Jordan Baker makes it for him. He wants Nick to invite Daisy over to his house for tea. And then he's going to happen to stop by. And he seems really concerned, too, about convincing Nick that there isn't going to be any sort of funny business going on. One of the things that Wolfsheim says is that Gatsby is the sort of guy that can be trusted around another man's wife. And he says that Jordan Baker wouldn't be involved either if she thought that anything dishonest was going on. Which, we might suspect because Nick doesn't believe that Jordan's that honest to begin with. But Gatsby, maybe he doesn't know that. He's just thinking Jordan's famous, so she wouldn't want to be involved in some marital scandal. But that does make us wonder what exactly Gatsby's doing here. Does he really just want to have a friendly chat with Daisy? Jordan doesn't even think so. She tells Nick that she remembers now that she'd seen Gatsby before, 5 years previously, when they all lived in Louisville. Before Daisy had married Tom, and before World War I had broken out. She had seen Gatsby and Daisy in a car together, clearly in love. So what happened? All Jordan knows is that Daisy had tried to stay in contact with Gatsby when he went off to the war, but her family had prevented it. And then she got engaged to Tom Buchanan. And Jordan says that she almost called off the wedding after getting another letter, presumably from Gatsby, and becoming super miserable. She got drunk, she was crying, she was distraught, but everyone persuaded her to change her mind and marry Tom. So there's a real emotional history here. But Nick does agree to set up the tea date. And when he does, Gatsby, he starts acting like a schoolboy with his first crush. He wants absolutely everything to be perfect for this reunion. that's being planned. He wants to have Nick's grass cut. He wants to have flowers brought into the house, the right sorts of snacks, desserts to have with tea. Everything has to be just right. And we find out later on why that is. He's been dreaming about this moment, almost obsessively, for over 5 years. And this explains just about every action that he's taken up to this point. Why he accumulated his fortune and bought his mansion and threw all of those parties. He says that he was hoping that one night, since everyone else in New York apparently showed up uninvited, that she would wander in too. So every night when he was having those wild parties, he was on the lookout for Daisy or for somebody that knew Daisy. And this becomes even more clear after this initial awkward meeting that they have over tea. There's silences, awkward pauses, straining to make conversation. And then finally, they decide to go over to tour Gatsby's mansion together. And Nick says this about Gatsby while they're on the tour. He hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual and astounding presence none of it was any longer real. Once he nearly toppled down a flight of stairs. He had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering upon a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now, in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock. So, the house, the fancy clothes, it was all for Daisy. And we also find out what the significance is of Gatsby's purchasing that particular mansion and of the green light that we saw him reaching towards earlier. The mansion is right across the bay from Daisy's house. On that same page, Gatsby says, if it wasn't for the mist, we could see your home across the bay. You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock. Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was, again, a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by 1. But there's a problem here. We can maybe pick up on the sense of foreboding at the end of that thought that Nick has. It's the same problem that Dexter dealt with in the short story Winter Dreams. Gatsby has made an idol out of Daisy. He's dreamed about her so much that there's a danger now that the reality of the situation won't measure up to his dreams. And this is something I think that we all do to an extent, whether it's toward a person that we haven't seen in a long time, or toward an event that we've been waiting for months, maybe a vacation or something like that. If we build our expectations up too high, we're sure to be disappointed. And it doesn't take long for us to see that this is what's happening to Gatsby. A little bit later, he gets Daisy and Tom to come to one of his parties, and Daisy doesn't like it. We read that it offends her, and inarguably because it wasn't a gesture, but an emotion. She was appalled by West Egg, this unprecedented place that Broadway had begotten upon a Long Island fishing village. Appalled by its raw vigor that chafed under the old euphemisms, and by the too obtrusive fate that herded its inhabitants along a shortcut from nothing to nothing. She saw something awful in the very simplicity she failed to understand. not a gesture, but an emotion. She's come from this world of East Egg, where everything is artificial. The jokes, the laughter, even the depression. Remember back in chapter 1 when she was talking to Nick about how depressed she was, and he got the impression that she was just putting on airs about even that. And now she's seen people behaving in this uncivilized way, right? Wearing their hearts on their sleeve. And she's pulling away from that. It's not how she's been brought up, and it's not the sort of life that she's lived with Tom up to this point. And Gatsby has another problem here, although it's related. His dream of Daisy is the Daisy of 5 years ago, not the current one. He gets frustrated that she doesn't seem to understand or want to go along with his plans like she did before. He wants her to tell Tom that she never loved him, to divorce him, and to move back to Louisville with him. They're going to get married at her parents' house. He's assuming a lot here that her parents are going to be okay with this, and they're going to pick up as if the intervening years never happened. And Nick says that he's asking too much of her. And then they have this really interesting exchange. I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadows of his house, just out of reach of his hand. I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before, he said, nodding determinedly. She'll see. He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. So, this is the same issue that Tom Buchanan has. Remember that Nick had said of him that he's restless. He's forever seeking the excitement of some irrecoverable football game that he played years and years ago. And now we read that Gatsby is trying to relive the past too. And he's running up against this same issue. It's irrecoverable. You can't go back to the past. But from what he says, Gatsby's going to do his best to try here. And we'll see where all of this leads him in the next 3 chapters, which you'll read for next time. Tom, meanwhile, doesn't trust Gatsby. Maybe he's already suspicious that there's something going on between him and his wife, but he's also kind of offended by the vulgarity and the brashness of the Gatsby party too. So he doesn't like him. And again, the fact that he's currently having an affair himself isn't likely to make him look kindly on any sort of proposal that Gatsby has to make. We talked last time about how Tom is enjoying his time with Myrtle for a fling, for a pastime, but that he probably doesn't have any real intentions of divorcing Daisy and settling down with Myrtle. So even though he treats her poorly, he cheats on her, we can expect him, too, to be fiercely protective toward Daisy if he thinks that someone's going to try to steal her away from him. And we'll see all that play out next week, too.